Welcome back, everyone, to the making of Assassin's Creed 15th anniversary. We are now going to tackle Chapter 5, Ancient Assassination. Assassin's Creed Origins. After releasing 2013's Black Flag, the development team that had shipped that title wanted to try something a little different. For about 3 months after the game shipped, Jean Guesden gave the crew free rein to have fun coming up with their next project. The team toyed around with ideas that took some of the proven concepts of the Assassin's Creed franchise in a very different direction. One of these was a different take on Black Flag's formula, where instead of piloting that game's jackdaw around the seas, players would have been navigating a rather different space. You were in the jackdaw, and by pressing a button you would take off, Guesden says, and there were floating islands that you could dock at. The idea was to toy with this notion of what went well with Black Flag. The strength of that world was its archipelago structure. Having a procedural sea is not worthwhile at some point, which meant we could focus the content on islands and points of interest. It was a big game, but it didn't take up as much space as the Caribbean we had in Black Flag did. The idea was whether we could do this kind of archipelago but in 3D. Another of these concepts would have taken the Assassin's Creed franchise in an incredibly different direction. Our artists were exploring oddball concepts, Guesden says. These ideas were way more sci-fi than anything we had done before. I was thinking about how I could give the artists as much freedom as possible, so I toyed with the idea of a first civilization game that would basically make anything conceivable. McDevitt adds, we felt limited by just sticking to realism. We toyed with the idea of doing a first Civ game. We had all these prototypes for flying hover ships, first Civ cities, and technology beyond your wildest dreams. The idea was that you'd be playing as one of the humans who had rebelled against the Isu. In the end, this concept was dropped. Though very enticing and technically part of the Assassin's Creed series, the idea of a first Civ game was likely too far away from the brand's core DNA. It would have been a hard sell internally, Guesden admits. The Assassin's Creed franchise is rooted in mystery. McDevitt adds, it would have been a really cool game, and we would have been able to do a lot of interesting things, but it probably wouldn't have had very broad appeal. First Civ is very self-contained within the Assassin's Creed brand. You'd have to really love the brand to want to play that game. Still, after being tired of Assassin's Creed after Black Flag, the developers used this exercise to shake the cobwebs from their minds. The team was once again ready to do something new within the franchise, but this time wanted to do something novel and fresh. Since its inception, the series had been encroaching nearer and nearer to the present day. At the time, Guesden had been reading up about Cleopatra, which turned their team's eye toward Egyptian history. I did a breakdown of the Greek, Roman, and Egyptian time period in a PowerPoint, Guesden explains. I had looked at the world potential, the narrative potential, the Assassins versus Templars potential, the secrecy, the gameplay, and so on. Through this, Guesden found that the period was a strong fit for the Assassin's Creed franchise. It was a turning point at the time, and was also rich with historical characters who would add color to a game set in this era. In pure historical or educational terms, it was wild, Guesden says. When you have Julius Caesar and Cleopatra, we are good. These are all Leonardo da Vinci-like characters. Everybody knows them, but not in detail. There were also some mythological and supernatural things that we could include. In the end, my pitch to headquarters was that this was the perfect setting for an Assassin's Creed game, especially when we wanted to refresh it. Thus, Assassin's Creed Origins was born. As is nearly always the case with game development, the initial plan for the project was far more ambitious in scope, with a setting that was far larger. We were basically considering the entirety of Cleopatra's reign, including Greece and Turkey, Guesden says. The idea was how could we leverage what we had learned with Black Flag. I saw the opportunity to use the Mediterranean Sea as a buffer from a technological standpoint between Egypt and Greece. We could have these massive land maps separated by water so that we could load one after another. This concept was actually prototyped using the same procedural generation tech that had been used for Tom Clancy's Ghost Recon Windlands. Not only did Montreal run into loading problems recreating the eastern coast of the Mediterranean Sea from Syria to Palestine via Lebanon, but the initial vision for this project would have required a lot of asset creation. Within 6 months to 9 months, we realized that this is a massive amount of content to create, McDevitt explains. We would have had to build all of the Greco-Roman areas, Turkey, Syria, Petra, and then Egypt. We were going to go only as far as Memphis and no further because it was just a massive area. We had a real come-to-Jesus moment where the team was sitting around and I was listing off everything we were going to need, a variety of character types, their outfits, equipment, and voices. The art team was going to have to design all these Greco-Roman elements. We also wanted a boat system. We wanted you to be able to jump on a trainer and go all over the map. Very early on, we recognized that we didn't want to fall into the same trap that Unity did. As a result, the team opted to reduce the game's scope and really focus on specific parts of this area. Long story short, at some point I said, let's just do a diptych, Wisdom explains. A diptych, Wisdom explains. We could have the rise of Cleopatra in Origins, and then have a second game taking place mostly in Greece and Turkey, about her relationship with Mark Antony. The latter would inspire Odyssey, the game that followed Origins. The reign of Cleopatra was an interesting point in time for an Assassin's Creed game, given that it was an era when the Egyptian Empire was in decline while the Roman Empire was only continuing to rise in prominence. People don't necessarily realize that it was an empire that was crumbling, as Asia says. They don't know that Cleopatra is basically the first ruler in hundreds and hundreds of years to even speak Egyptian. Her own dynasty, the Ptolemaic, hadn't bothered to learn the language. It was a fascinating time. There's an amazing mix of every cliche we know about Egypt. We had the pyramids, the way the warriors dressed, and we could include everything that the average person would know. In addition, we had an amazing cast, so that was definitely the time period where we wanted to set our game. A new creed. Origins was also perhaps the largest leap that the Assassin's Creed series had made in terms of gameplay in quite some time. Even before the lukewarm reception to both Unity and Syndicate, there was clearly a feeling within Ubisoft that the franchise needed to be refreshed in some way. For Origins, the team started to incorporate more elements from RPGs into the mix. This included things like an entirely revamped combat system, inspired in part by CD Projekt's The Witcher 3 Wild Hunt, while the missions of the other older games were swapped out for multi-part quests. We're always inspired and motivated by the games that come out during development, that's for sure, Wisdom explains. The Witcher 3 definitely brought something very strong to the table for a lot of people, including members of the dev team. We looked at it very carefully and seriously. We already knew we wanted to move forward into the RPG section. Black Flag, for example, had a very good playtime, which was supported by the progression you could invest both in Edward and in the Jackdaw. Then we looked at the narrative. We made the narrative evolve from a story, from the stories and missions basically, to quests. That was also an enormous transformation. Changing the combat mechanics might not seem like much to some players, but from a development standpoint, it was a huge alteration. The system moved from being governed by animations to hitboxes. Fighting had become very old, Griezmann says. We had received a lot of criticism about the redundancies in the combat system, and the fact that it wasn't allowing for much player progression. Once you knew how to counterattack, that was pretty much it. Ever since the first Assassin's Creed, the game's fights had really been animation driven. We had some very cool animations with a lot of attention paid to the contact, the inertia, the hit, which made for some very cool slow-mo trailers. But in terms of player experience, a lot of games had come out since the first Assassin's Creed that had more dynamic and responsive combat systems. Moving to a hitbox-based combat system required a huge amount of work, but it also required a massive change in mentality for the developers working on Origins. We needed to refresh combat, but that was a big shift because the time it meant that it wouldn't be animation-driven anymore. Instead, it would be more code-driven and reactive, Guisden says. We had to make a lot of changes to allow an animation to end whenever the player decided to do something else. We also had to accept the fact that it would look less realistic in a way. This mindset and cultural shift were big things, not only technologically speaking, but for all the team, because some members had carefully been doing animation for 10 years and making these as realistic as possible. Now, all of a sudden, we were telling them that the fun and the reactiveness of the inputs was more important than them not clipping. The introduction of more RPG mechanics, such as deeper customization and crafting, gave greater depth to the world, and also provided a way for the developers to gate off content in the world of Origins. Previously, players would simply be told that they couldn't go into an area by means of an obvious wall. With this game, keeping players in specific areas would be much more organic. In Origins, you could go wherever you wanted to from the very beginning, but we needed to make sure that the player would at some point be in a city to witness some of the major events of the main narrative, as Asia says. So we introduced what we called soft gating. If you were in an area that you weren't supposed to be in, enemies would be way too strong for you. That's a way of showcasing that you weren't strong enough, and that you needed to upgrade your character, do a couple of quests, or spend some time in the other regions of the world before getting there. By changing the formula that was in the very beginning of earlier Assassin's Creed games, I'd say that the invisible wall was now very visible. How the world works. The other seismic change to the Assassin's Creed formula was in how the development team approached creating Origins' world. This entry in the series did away with the urban design of Unity and Syndicate, instead building upon the worlds of Assassin's Creed 3 and Black Flag. One way that the crew managed to make the game's setting feel alive was with what it called the Meta AI. This was actually developed in parallel with another feature, the Eagle. Due to the game's setting, the team initially wanted to have the protagonist, Bayek, use this bird of prey to scout out the world rather than relying on the syncing system of previous games. There weren't tons of super tall buildings in Egypt that players could use to see how the world worked, as Asia says. That's why the team decided to introduce the Eagle mechanic, which you can send up and which acted like a drone. Players were able to see their surroundings from a long way away, and they could see characters moving, or a hippopotamus attacking someone. Basically, the players could see the world from another point of view, akin to a godlike game. That's how a lot of features and other things were connected organically to one another. It was showcasing that world, that system, and the world was at the core of the whole creation. And then it was about being legitimate and respecting the franchise. While the team had found a novel solution to the syncing problem, they worried that from an aerial perspective, the world of Origins ran the risk of looking too empty and lifeless. We were in a massive country, and we wanted to make it even more alive than before, Wisden explains. It needed to be even more credible a setting, so as to give the player even more opportunities. We came up with this idea of the Eagle allowing you to see the world at a large scale. But when you did that, you were able to see a long way into the distance. In order to maintain the illusion that the world was alive, the player needed to believe in the motions of these entities that are supposed to be alive. With the old system, and most games are still using this, there was a kind of bubble where NPCs, like humans, animals, or whatever, are actually living just around the player. Because we couldn't compute thousands of these entities filling the map, with the Eagle, we actually see a long way off. We couldn't have the NPCs just doing nothing, because it would break the immersion. The way the meta AI worked was that NPCs could effectively be in two different modes, depending on how far away they were from the player. When they were further away, an entity was reduced to its basic health points, had an agenda, and moved around the world. It looked believable enough, Wisden explains. For example, if there was a lion far away from the player, all that the lion knew in-game was that it was a lion, it was in good health, and it would just be roaming in the world. If it had passed by an antelope, it would have probably gone and attacked it. When the player got closer, then we would have the full AI load with all the reactions and animations and so on. If you were close to that lion, it would probably attack you because the full AI with all the reactions had loaded. Not only was the meta AI used to provide a sense of vibrancy to the world of Origins, it also tied into some of the game's missions. Even little things like quest givers, not just remaining in the same place, gave the sense that Bayek was not the center of this world. People had agency and inner lives of their own. This allowed us to test the narrative, Wisden says. With the older systems, it meant that a mission giver traditionally spawned in a place, was waiting for you, there, and would always be in that place. With this AI, we could have people actually roaming the world. You had to find them so that they could give you a mission or quest or whatever. Everything was tied into the meta AI. Seeing the mission giver moving in the world was for me a big win, and it reinforced the fact that the world was really living, no matter if you were there or not. Azazia adds, we said that all the non-playable characters would have an agenda, whether the player is there or not. They're going to be doing something. They're going to hunt or go on missions. If the player accepts one particular mission, The game will say that you have to hunt down a target around an area of the city. However, the target's objective is to report in the north of Egypt, and then to go to Rome. Depending on where you choose to attack, you'll see that this character is at a different place on the map, or that he can even leave, and you'll end up missing the target because he's got his own agenda and his own life. We thought that would create interesting antidotes and moments where every player doesn't have the same experience because there are a lot of things that are out of their control. The meta AI system also introduced some rather interesting gameplay mechanics, such as how players tackled enemy locations. Everything is dynamic. You can follow NPCs around. They work in the field. They sleep. They eat. They even pee, Lozanov laughs. There are some specific sites, such as military locations, where if you observe an area long enough, you'll see specific spots where guards go to relieve themselves. You can use this information to your advantage and catch them off guard. This was a wildly ambitious mechanic to introduce into the game, one that required a lot of hard technical work. This is part of the reason why it was only available in a few missions within Origins. We didn't have a lot of quests using this because basically everything was developed in tandem, Guiston admits, so you never know it works until it actually works. We cannot pull all our eggs in the same basket and say all our missions or quests will use this system. Still, Guiston is proud of the work that the team put into creating these systems together, not least because it was an organic innovation that developers came up with themselves. The Eagle came about after some programmers prototyped it. The other major development came from people saying we should use a minimalistic real-time strategy game AI, wherein on a larger scale, Guiston says. The beauty was in taking all these ingredients and putting them together into something which was coherent, which made sense, and where every part actually reinforced the whole. Back to the start. It took the team some time to land on who the protagonist of Assassin's Creed Origins was going to be. Mostly this came down to making sure the character starred in the title made sense within the context of its gameplay. Eventually they settled on Bayek, a member of the Medjay, which was essentially a desert police force. Bayek was a hard one to pull off, much harder than Edward Kenway, Guiston says. It was much easier for Edward because there was the pirate fantasy element. With Bayek, we struggled for a long time with the question of who he was and what he was doing. The difficulty when you are creating an open world is always in trying to reduce this ludonarrative dissonance. Ludonarrative dissonance describes the difference between what is happening in gameplay and what is occurring in the narrative. For example, the protagonist is against violence in all of the cutscenes, but is then gleefully mowing down foes in gameplay. You want to tell a story, but the player can do only certain types of actions. As always, what Bayek was going to be doing was exploring a huge open world, as well as getting into fights. Why would you have this character fight, Guiston says? It's never easy to create a motivation in the first place that involves the character seeking vengeance while they're doing good things. You end up with very few options that will justify such behavior. For Bayek, because he is a Medjay, which was this old kingdom cult that was sent by the pharaoh, this means he won't be recognizable to your enemies. On the other hand, you want him to be recognizable in a positive way by members of the public who might want to ask him for help. That was the tricky part. Bayek was never created as the solo main character of the Assassin's Creed Origins story. He was always part of a larger narrative involving his partner, Aya. Aya was always in the mix, but not always in the same role, Guiston explains. To start with, they were just friends who had been exiled. Then we had to reshuffle the stories to make this relationship stronger, so we made them a married couple that had lost their son. Beetle adds, Bayek and Aya were just a real couple. That felt refreshing. They were a family, and it felt like he was very human in so many ways, even though he was still obviously a badass. Some of the other characters and Assassin's Creed protagonists came across as superheroes. They were a bit standoffish and unrelatable, but Bayek felt like someone I could actually know. For the team, it was vital that the main character was not only Egyptian, but also someone who was in touch with the older ideals of a country that had suffered successive invasions from foreign powers like the Greeks and Romans. We wanted Bayek to represent this Egypt that was actually fading away, Guiston says. There are some very interesting stories to be told about the transmission of heritage, of culture, of religion, what you believe, and so on. Origins was also the first game set in a polytheistic setting, which opened up a lot of opportunities, but at the same time we weren't used to that. There were a lot of challenges. In the end, I think we managed to make him an adult suffering from the death of his son, fighting while dealing with this big loss and actually not knowing exactly who he was fighting for. In some ways, Bayek was like Ezio, and trying to find his place in the world in the wake of tragedy. But in contrast to the franchise's Italian Renaissance hero, Bayek was already a capable fighter. Ezio was living the good life before that was taken from him, Grayston says. Assassin's Creed 2 is really about him building himself up. Bayek is already a grown-up, and now he has to struggle with the fact that he thought he had everything in his life, his family, and so on. But now it's gone. He's not sure how the world is evolving with this new Greek queen, with the Romans arriving. It's a lot to process. Of course, the story of Bayek and Aya is about more than them seeking revenge after the death of their son at the hand of the Order of the Ancients. Their pain is transformative, and it would go on to have widespread ripples across the world of Assassin's Creed. There is this very touching and moving love story between Bayek and Aya, where they know they won't ever get their old lives back. Their family is gone. It's over, Guiston explains. They need to move past that, but at the same time they decide consciously that because their first creation, their son, has died, they want to create something that will ideally last for a very long time. That's the Hidden Ones, the organization that would eventually become the Assassin's Brotherhood. In the end, I think fans liked the story because it showed that this group of people was born out of pain, sadness, and sorrow. But for me, this really embodied what an assassin believes. They can live through hard times, but manage to transform that into something positive for others. This tied into a broader conversation that was happening at Ubisoft about the time period. How could an Assassin's Creed game feature assassins long before the Brotherhood was actually founded? A lot of people came to me the same way they had come to me asking how we were going to do an Assassin's Creed pirate game. Wisdom laughs. They came to me saying, how can we have an Assassin's Creed game 1,000 years before the Assassins actually exist? But like in Black Flag, the series focuses on this never-ending tension between free will and order. Within this framework, we can create many stories, and we set out to tell the story of the genesis of the Brotherhood and origins. The Hidden Ones were linked to Amun, the Egyptian god, which meant the Hidden One was everywhere but nobody saw him. And so, when you take all these ingredients and you work on them, and you think them through, you are able to come up with things that make total sense. Though Origins was set over 1,000 years before the events of the first Assassin's Creed, Wisdom felt it was important to make sure that the game felt linked to the overall franchise. The most important angle to consider, in order to make sure it was still an AC game, was the narrative, Wisdom explains. I made some presentations about using the feather like Altair. We explained the cut fingers as a result of the hidden blade. We chose to have Bayek wear a hood, but it was missing the peak. Overall, there was a feeling that this was the first time we were returning to a Middle Eastern, North African setting, which was also creating this connection with the first Assassin's Creed. As well as a fresh take on the historical aspect of Assassin's Creed, Ubisoft changed things up with the game's modern framing too. Since Assassin's Creed 3 and the death of Desmond, there hadn't really been a main character for this part of the franchise. Black Flag had seen players taking on the role of an anonymous Abstergo employee. Similarly, Unity and Syndicate didn't give the modern-day character any kind of identity either. Those modern-day sections for these two games were intended to tie into the Initiate's platform. The player was meant to be the contemporary character, viewing historical memories via the Animus. This changed with Origins, which once again had players taking on the role of a specific present-day protagonist. At some point you need to acknowledge what is going well and what is not going well, Wisdom says. With Unity and Syndicate, we had wanted the player to be this character that was fully integrated with Initiates. In the end, we really had to acknowledge the fact that it didn't work as well as expected. Our really hardcore fans were into it, but we realized that very few players actually understood the whole thing. Without this global vision of the universe that we were proposing, it no longer made much sense. At some point, you just have to ask who you were playing as. This time around, players were taking on the role of Layla Hassan, an Egyptian Templar turned assassin. If nothing else, she was created to be more of a character than the blank slate that Desmond was. Layla has much more of a say in what happens to her. Desmond was pretty much a victim, Queeson says. He was just trying to understand what was happening. With Layla, we brought in a new character who is very driven and who is actively acting against the will of her employer. It's almost like she's representing us as developers. We have the tech, we can do whatever we want, and we can even bend previously established rules. We wanted Layla to be a hero who is into the hard sciences. There was this connection with modern Egypt, because that's something quite distinct to ancient Egypt. Today's Arabic Egyptians have different beliefs and cultural practices from the ancient Egyptians, but they still represent their roots. So much has happened along Egypt's historical path. What is presented in Origins isn't necessarily directly connected, but there are still connections. Layla, being Egyptian, allowed us to explore those ideas. Modern problems. At the time, Origins had the oldest setting for an Assassin's Creed game, with previous entries in the franchise being set progressively closer to the present day. There were some notable advantages. These included having greater research and more information available about a specific era, but it also meant less freedom to insert the series' revisionist history, as well as limiting players' actions. It was becoming a little bit challenging, with guns becoming more prevalent the nearer to the present day we reached, Luhi says. Assassin's Creed and guns do not fit well together in some of the gameplay. When we did have guns, they were always capable of just one or two shots. We never had an assault rifle or anything like that. Perhaps unsurprisingly, going back to the Egyptian period required a great deal of research, not least because the events of Origins take place 2.066 years before its 2017 release. Events of Origins take place 2,066 years before its 2017 release. For Durand, part of the challenge in how the game would represent Egypt in the period was in separating reality from a lot of the mystery and mythology that surround the civilization. One of the big risks is that there's a lot of passion regarding ancient Egypt that's based around mystery, he explains. As a historian, that's attractive to use. People go and study Egypt because it's so far away and foreign. Of course, in reality, it's humankind. There are always mythological aspects that are invented by humans, but they're unique to ancient Egypt, so I think that was interesting. One of the other challenges when it came to the time period was the landmarks and how they would be portrayed within Origins. Most of the locations that the team wanted to depict, even at the time of Queen Cleopatra, had long since disappeared, Durand says. There's a lot of fantasy around them. From the very start, we knew we were going to do the pyramids. That was a no-brainer. But even then, there were a lot of discussions about the way that we would depict them. Were we going to produce them faithfully? That is to say, as faithfully as possible. Or were we going to go in and bring a lot of fantasy to these elements? Would the pyramids lead to underground tunnels and first civilization aspects? That technically would make a lot of sense in Assassin's Creed games, but at the same time, maybe it would have been too obvious, or it may have diminished the value of these monuments for what they really are, which is just very big tombs. With Origins, the way the team approached the real-life historical setting of the game was more about authenticity than accuracy, simply because it was so long ago that a lot of guesswork was involved. My perception on this has evolved after working with these games, Durand says. The further we go back in time, the more we're trying to achieve authenticity, a sense of immersion, than trying to reach for accuracy. For me, on a day-to-day basis, in terms of research, it didn't change anything. It's really more the way that the team is going to work with the material that makes a difference. For example, the city of Memphis, it's almost vanished into oblivion today in terms of archaeological reports, but we had some information and descriptions of the city. There was a little bit of archaeology, and this is why I think it was very interesting for the team to work with archaeologists and with Jean-Claude Golvin, who made these archaeological plans and paintings to help the group envision a possible past. Instead of relying on the team to invent stuff, I think it was very interesting that they wanted to be inspired by what was believable as a view of the past. Personally, I think I did more and better research than I had done previously because I knew that we were working on a Discovery Tour project simultaneously. I knew that we would bring everything to light. I think for the rest of the team, it didn't make a big difference, but for me, it added even more weight because I wanted to make sure that what we were going to do was justified. As always, the crew planned to head out to Egypt to gather reference materials for Origins. However, growing conflict and general unrest in the region led to them having to cancel these plans. John and the other directors on the project looked into going to Egypt and were told that we would need a bodyguard for every person, Louis says. It would have been a ridiculous amount of overhead, a huge cost. So in the end, it was decided that it wasn't feasible. That being said, the events of the game were so far in the past that Durand didn't believe that a research trip was vital for creating Origins. Even going to Egypt would not have provided us with information regarding the city of Memphis or most of the cities that we were producing in the game, because they don't exist anymore, he laughs. I'm not saying it was valueless. It would have been very valuable to go there, but the logistics and resources that it would have taken to get our team there were probably better used in hiring these anthropologists, archaeologists, and specialists who helped us to make it right. One of the central sources of information was Jean-Claude Gauvin, a French researcher, archaeologist, and architect who also happens to be an illustrator. He did a ton of watercolors for us, drawing a lot of inspiration, not only from his scientific knowledge, but also from his skill as an artist. He helped us with problem solving through his sketches and paintings, Lacoste says. That was really cool and inspiring. One of the other ways that the team came up with the world for Origins was to just think about what it must have been like for people to live in this part of the world at that point in time, starting up at the pyramids and other landmarks in the region. When we brought to life these different cities and the pyramids, it was important to put ourselves in the shoes of the people living there, Lacoste says. We tried to envision someone who was living in the countryside and harvesting wheat. They would see these huge pyramids in the distance as simple shapes reflecting the sunlight. That must have been incredibly amazing. We wanted to make sure that the player could see that as they play the game, to not only see the version of the pyramids we can see today, but to travel in time to what they were like then. That's really the fantasy of this time machine, I think. Just putting yourself in the shoes of these people, imagining what it was like for someone seeing the lighthouse of Alexandria for the first time, something that was 134 meters high. That's like us seeing the Burj Khalifa in Dubai today, and it's preposterous because this was over 2,000 years ago. Much of the work done on the pyramids was handled by Ubisoft's Sophia studio. We spent a lot of time imagining and researching the whole fantasy around the pyramids and what they could have been like at the time, Lozanov says. It was an enormous mandate for the studio, and the pyramids were huge too. We wanted to have a one-to-one scale for them. That means that the footprint of the pyramid has the same surface area as New York City and New Orleans from Liberation did in terms of scale. The Origins team also used Google Maps in lieu of heading out to Egypt to gather research materials. Of course, the landscape is rather different now to how it was over 2 millennia ago. A lot has changed in the last 2,000 years, Louis says, especially with irrigation and modern farming. The amount of water they would have had back then compared to now is very different. For example, the lake that the Singapore team made in Fayoum is a lot smaller now on Google Maps than it was back then. That's just part of where we're at with irrigation and climate change in those parts of the world. One of the challenges that Duran found was translating what the team found in research texts and recreating that in a video game. Because, well, what was written about the period just hadn't stood the test of time. For instance, there's this book that we use regarding the siege of Alexandria, he explains. Julius Caesar went to Egypt for political reasons and he was stuck in Alexandria. He wrote an account of what happened, but when we look at the accounts that he wrote, or what someone wrote on his behalf, there are missing elements. A lot of historians have worked on these records without seeing what Alexandria looked like, without having access to the archaeological information that we have access to today. It was wonderful to be in the 21st century and have access to this information so that we could see, for instance, how the city of Alexandria was built in reality compared to the descriptions that were made by earlier historians. Because we were making a game, we were motivated to find that information, so we had to put it into context. Working on ancient Egypt is where I've learned the most so far. Negative space. While the team wanted to create a world full of content that people would spend a lot of time playing with, they were also wary of saturating Origin's setting with too many things to do. We didn't want to bring to life a world that looked too much like an amusement park. Is so close together, Lacoste explains. You want to fill this negative space in open lands. For instance, there's a nice transition between the Great Giza Plateau and Alexandria, where you travel to see. There's a sense of traveling through time by employing this negative space. We have these moments of journeying between different important hubs in the story and also in the gameplay. One of the ways that this feeling of negative space was created was with deserts within Origins. These weren't just barren wastes of sand dunes, and they actually came with some interesting gameplay mechanics. We developed what we call the desert overheat system, Lozanov explains. When you're overexposed to heat in the desert, you start to hallucinate because of the lack of water and being overheated. We use it as a gameplay system in places to create an experience of being in the desert. We need to have some open spaces for the game to breathe, so it's not only intense gameplay sequences or intense environments. We needed a place in between these open spaces where you take a breath as a player, enjoy the scenery, prepare for your next journey, etc. And the desert gave us this. It was naturally a place to have a calmer experience. The team wasn't aiming for a photorealistic aesthetic in Origins. While it had inherited an impressive lighting system from Assassin's Creed Unity, the team still wanted to have a stylized visual direction for the game. We didn't aim for the pure photographic visual direction. We wanted something that was more pencil-y and which resembled 19th century paintings, Lacoste says. We felt like it was more sensual, interesting, and artistic. We found a balance between what we called the DVR-based rendering and also this kind of stylization with color correction. Though the crew wasn't targeting aesthetic realism for most of the game's design, there was one area where they aimed for realism: lighting. The team ended up consulting NASA tech documentation to better understand how lighting worked. We wanted to make sure that every single biome had a unique atmosphere and lighting, Lacoste explains. To do this, we used this interesting time of day evolution of the sun in the sky, which would lead to the atmosphere and also the actual air density. So there would be a difference from the drier Qatar depression to the Nile Delta, where we wanted the player to feel the humidity and have a very different sense of light coming through the shadows. That would also help the player feel like they were almost living in different places within the same country. Once again, Ubisoft Singapore was brought in to work on the water tech. The studio was tasked with handling the Fayum region, which includes two lakes, Marotis and Fayum. Singapore also handled naval gameplay for Origins. Given the vast difference in the time period, this was a very different experience to what they had previously created for Assassin's Creed 3, Black Flag, and Rogue. This was before the era of cannonballs, so it was all about shooting flaming arrows and firebombs, Louis says. There was also a lot of ramming into other boats. The introduction of the meta AI in Origins was a challenge for the entire team, but nowhere was this felt more keenly than at Ubisoft Singapore. Although we did lots of simulations that were much more advanced on Origins, we first focused on the water, Louis says. But it's almost harder on water. You can't see people walking around a town from a great distance. However, you can see 40 or 60 meter treants going around their daily routines, because obviously they're much more visible. We couldn't do a technical shortcut to teleport or despawn them, or anything, because it would have been massively obvious. Voyage of Discovery. The desire to make an educational component of Assassin's Creed goes all the way back to Assassin's Creed 2 at least. Ubisoft had previously leveraged its historical research with the Animus database, a codex that detailed elements of the time period. But Origins was the first entry in the franchise to fully follow through with this promise with Discovery Tour. Released in February 2018, after the title's release, it allowed players to roam the game's world in a series of guided tours that showcased the history of the time. This started as a personal project for Maxime Durand almost 4 years earlier. After Assassin's Creed Unity launched in 2014, I realized that we had to do something with these games to make them available for more audiences, for teachers, for museums, he explains. We've been trying to do partnerships. We had these testimonies of teachers. I personally was motivated as a historian to bring that into classrooms. I started building a project with the execs at Ubisoft to get some funding on doing an educational mode for the series. I knew that it was going to be challenging. One of the higher-ups that Durand ended up speaking to was Jean Guisden, who was instrumental in convincing Ubisoft to give Discovery Tour the green light. From there, the team just had to figure out exactly what they wanted to do with this project. Not only was this designed to be used in an educational capacity, it needed to be as widely available as possible. We created the guided tours at first, and then removed the violence from the game, as these were the two most important objectives, Durand explains. We also knew that other challenges we would face was the accessibility of the product. Most teachers were not going to use consoles. They would be using Chromebooks, which we knew were not powerful enough to run the game. We were aware that streaming devices were coming, but these would be after our release. There was also the small matter of just what users would be able to do in Discovery Tour. How artifacts are integrated into game environments is important. I remember showing one specific museum the state of Assassin's Creed Origins at the time. The player could destroy pots and tombs, Durand laughs. I remember the museum creators were frightened, wondering why we would allow the player to destroy these artifacts. What we allow players to do in a typical game and what is allowed normally in a museum are very different. Extra time. As work continued on Origins, the development team asked Ubisoft's Paris headquarters for another year to work on the game. This was the first time since 2009 that Assassin's Creed had not been released annually. We said we needed an extra year to polish the game so it would be a solid experience, as Azia says. We told them it was going to be costly. It would be an expensive year and an expensive game. But if our ambition was to reboot the franchise and to come up with a fresh game, then that was what we needed. Ubisoft was willing to give the team another year because it allowed a bit of space for players too. HQ really got the message, and they were okay with us taking the time that was needed. After Syndicate, they understood that Assassin's Creed doesn't need to be an annual franchise. It was okay to let the franchise breathe in between releases. One reason why Ubisoft management might have been okay with not having an Assassin's Creed game to launch in 2016 was the fact that it had Watch Dogs 2 releasing at the end of that year. Perhaps that game would fill the open world gap left by Assassin's Creed. The fact that the Assassin's Creed film was launching that same year might have helped as well. We knew the movie could give us an extra year where the brand would be really strong, as AZ explains. The brand would reach new territories and audiences with the film. We would have a lot of business opportunities. We were able to focus our marketing efforts on the movie before coming back to Origins the following year. Following its October 2017 launch, Origins was overwhelmingly praised, not only for the changes that the Montreal team had made to the Assassin's Creed formula, but also for its visuals and historical accuracy. Sales in the title's first 10 days were double those of Syndicate. Origins would go on to sell over 10 million copies by March 2020. In short, the gamble had paid off, giving the team the leeway to reinvent the franchise, while also giving them an extra year for development had yielded huge rewards for Ubisoft. Now it was time to press the point. The Curse of the Pharaohs. While Assassin's Creed Origins leaned heavily into the historical reality of Egyptian life during the Ptolemaic dynasty, Ubisoft Sofia wanted to explore more of the spiritual and mythical elements of this period in the Curse of the Pharaohs expansion. Set 4 years after Origins, the game saw Bayek heading to the Valley of the Kings in Thebes to investigate reports on the mystical artifact in the area, one that will be very familiar to fans of the Assassin's Creed franchise. We didn't want to do a fantasy adventure game. We wanted something grounded in our lore, something that only Assassin's Creed could do, Lazanov explains. In the codex pages that Ezio was collecting, Altair wrote that one of the features of the Apple of Eden is to manipulate your mind and make you think that you'll get what you want. It creates an illusion. So we used this as one of the tools to create these mythical people. Basically, we projected the beliefs of people into reality, creating an artificial reality. Because of the Apple of Eden's power and Bayek's belief in the mythology of the period, these mystical deities could appear to come to life and haunt our protagonist. People forget that Assassin's Creed is actually a sci-fi game, Lazanov says. We have the Animus, which is pretty much a virtual reality projection. There are layers of reality, like in Inception. The Apple of Eden shares its power to project the beliefs of people, and people believe that the pharaohs are their gods. They believe that Atum is the sun, Amun is the sun god, and all the rest. They made etchings of these gods on the walls of the pyramids and wrote the stories. All these beliefs are actually from the Apple of Eden. It basically projects these beliefs around you. It was a mixture of the earlier beliefs of the Egyptians, which we spent a lot of time researching in order to get them right. We wanted to be respectful to the culture and to glean all the nuances and ideas there without butchering or oversimplifying them. Then we projected our lore onto it to create it as a game. Queens of Egypt, Museum Exhibitions. In 2018, the exhibition Queens of Egypt was created at the Pointe-à-Claire Museum in Montreal. It called on the teams from Assassin's Creed Origins and Discovery Tour to offer an immersive experience through monumental projections inspired by Origins environments, created exclusively for this project, and scenes from the sumptuous and palatable seat of the Pharaoh's power, the arid and mysterious western desert, the houses and streets of a bustling village, and the daily lives of women in power. Visitors were able to discover carefully created and accurate visual portrayals of life in Egypt at the time. Queens of Egypt went on to be adapted for the much larger spaces of the Canadian Museum of History in 2021. The collaboration between the Pointe-à-Claire Museum and Ubisoft was renewed in 2022 with the exhibition Vikings, Dragons of the Northern Seas, which welcomed more than 325,000 people. This time, visitors were able to experience the real and mythical worlds of the Vikings through an immersive journey told in 4 great tales: the tale of origins, of life, of travel, and of the end of days, all through a breathtaking exhibition punctuated with images from Assassin's Creed Valhalla. We are so proud to see our games used in classrooms and being presented in exhibitions all around the world, serving to explore history, says Maxime Durand. Assassin's Creed Odyssey. Having proven itself with a variety of DLC it had worked on in the past, as well as 2015 Syndicate, Ubisoft Quebec was chosen to lead whatever project followed Assassin's Creed Origins. As mentioned earlier, the initial plan for Origins was to cover the entire Mediterranean basin. Limitations, both technical and time-wise, meant that this wasn't possible, so the project was split up. Montreal would work on a game centered around Egypt, while Quebec would develop a project that focused on Greece at around the same time. This soon changed, with Quebec proposing a game that was set further back in the past. We were asking ourselves what it made sense to build after Origins, Cote explains. There was a lot of interest in going back to the foundation of Western society with the Greek philosophers. Obviously, we were in the Mediterranean with Origins, but one of the things that was very important for the team, and I remember there being a bit of friction around that, was we didn't want to build a direct sequel to Origins. Initially, Origins was going to center on Cleopatra and Caesar in Egypt, while a potential follow-up was going to be about Cleopatra and Mark Antony in Greece. The Quebec team had different ideas. What we had found in the past is that it's very, very difficult, in terms of production, to have 2 projects that are so codependent story-wise and script-wise back-to-back, Cote explains. If you recall, Odyssey came out about 11 months after Origins. It's tricky to go into full-fledged production if you're building a direct sequel when the other game isn't even finished yet, because anything can happen. Origins went from being about the entire Mediterranean basin to then just Egypt and to then a smaller part of Egypt. If you're planning out a monstrous sequel to a monstrous game, it's very tough. That's why we wanted more independence, which is something that we keep in mind going forward to make sure that our teams don't have the hard constraints coming from the team before them. That way the second team can start production sooner and build higher quality games. We came to 450 BC Greece both out of production needs and the creative desire to explore the origins of the philosophical foundation of our Western society. There is something quite funny about the Assassin's Creed franchise, having gone back thousands of years for its origin story, only for the game that immediately followed it to be set even further in the past. You should have seen the discussion about that. Some were asking, should we call it Origins Origin? Cote laughs. We spent so much time discussing this and determining how we would make it understandable. On the face of it, it didn't make sense, but I think what people cared more about was that Odyssey was an excellent game and a worthy entry in the franchise. Much like Origins, the team had to work out how to tie the game to the Assassin's Creed series. Odyssey was set before the birth of the Assassin Brotherhood, but as always, there were greater thematic connections that ran through the franchise, which helped the Quebec studio out. We did find ways to tie it to the overall lore of the franchise. Obviously, yes, it's before there were assassins, so it's not the history of how the assassins came to be, Cote says. But this conflict between chaos and order is universal in a way. For me, one of the overarching themes of Assassin's Creed, perhaps even more important than control versus free will, is that we're nearly always told stories about family. Syndicate is the story of a brother and a sister. Unity is all about your heritage and what you need to do to disconnect from the reputation that you inherited from your parents. Both the Kenway Saga and the Ezio trilogy are about family. Playing the role. As has been the case, Odyssey was built upon the foundation that Origins had laid out in 2017. The RPG elements that were introduced in the earlier project were something that the Quebec studio had been interested in for quite some time. Now these elements had their time to shine. This included dialogue choices that allowed players to better express themselves within the game. This was something that the team really wanted to do. Some of these ideas dated back from what we were doing back on Assassin's Creed 3, Cote says. I remember pitching to Alex Hutchinson, who was creative director back on Assassin's Creed 3, the idea of adding a dialogue system in the homestead so that we could add more depth to Connor. Obviously, that would have been way too early and would have been too much of a technological endeavor at that point to undertake, but we came back to it on Odyssey. The decision to lean into RPG mechanics was partly due to the team's passion for these kinds of games. Still, there were some other very good reasons. I think there was a recognition in the industry that players would engage more with games that promoted autonomy, relatedness, and competence over time, Cote explains. RPGs are really well suited for that. As we've improved on these elements over time, one of the things that we've noticed is that people became more engaged in the franchise. We've seen huge increases in terms of player engagement on our past Assassin's Creed games. People get more involved in our universe. Competency could be achieved organically as the player experienced the game, but how would the pillars of autonomy and relatedness be represented? There are two big pillars to increasing relatedness which we wanted to provide to players, Cote explains. The first one was being able to choose between the protagonists, Cassandra and Alexios. It's about relatedness and representation. We wanted players to choose an avatar that felt more like them. The other aspect of it was to give players more agency and autonomy in the moment-to-moment decisions that they could make. You have a branching narrative that impacts the outcome of the game. Dialogue choices might not have changed anything at the moment-to-moment gameplay, but how you reacted to a character talking to you, aggressively, passively, or if you ignored them altogether, that improved your relationship with the game. You felt more engaged with the experience. We were strong believers in that. All of the investment that we did in terms of building new gameplay or narratives was to improve upon this. All of this was new to the Assassin's Creed franchise, both on a feature level, but also on a technical one too. The Quebec team had to create new tools from scratch in order to support its vision. We had around 30 hours of dialogue in the game, Dansero explains. That's the equivalent of a lot of movies if you want to think about it that way. There was no way that we could have produced 30 hours of gameplay the old way we made games, so we had to invent a dialogue editor. This was a tool that automatically placed cameras in a scene based on the script. It also generated facial expressions in our characters based on different emotions that the design could play with. You would very quickly end up with a great-looking scene without having to go through mocap and all the traditional ways of doing dialogue or cinematics. That goes back to Quebec having a strong programming support and 3D programmers who created tools to help us deliver a game that had a huge amount of data. We had basically the same time to do Odyssey that we did for Syndicate, but then the amount of content was triple what was in Syndicate, if not more. Within Ubisoft, there were some concerns about the RPG-centric vision that Quebec had for Odyssey, but at the same time this was a shift that the entire game industry had been going through for years. It's still an ongoing topic even today, as Azia says. We're still discussing how much of an RPG our games should or could be. It's a bit weird because most games have turned into RPGs. This isn't something new for games. If you look at Gran Turismo on the original PlayStation, it was literally a driving game that had tons of RPG elements. Instead of traditional levels, players would have to pass a license testing system. Instead of being granted new equipment at regular intervals, players would have to win races in order to upgrade their cars. Even in a game like God of War, the player was gathering materials and crafting. It felt like a natural path for Assassin's Creed because it increases engagement. People spend more time in the game. Most people tend to forget, but Assassin's Creed 2 already had weapons and armor with statistics. Assassin's Creed Unity already had a level system. As the game's reveal approached, the PR team started trying to figure out how they would announce the project. Was this just going to be a trailer, or would there be anything that members of the media could play to preview Odyssey? The team said the game would be playable when it was announced, Beta laughs. I was like, holy cow. Really? They had between 4 and 6 hours ready to be played, so right there and then we played a few hours at the studio. We decided that the plan for the reveal was to have 4 hours of gameplay. We would outline what the media could write about. There were certain parts that weren't quite finished or that contained spoilers. I really wanted journalists to walk out of that first reveal and say without a doubt that this is a full RPG game. That strategy paid off in such a huge way. He convinced the journalists. It reassured the dev team of what they had, which was exciting. Part of the reason why the crew had so much of the game ready so early was due to them being entirely aware of how big Odyssey was compared to anything else they had worked on in the past. They scoped and planned it out very, very well, Beetle says. What they were able to deliver at that moment in time was so good, polished, and ready to be shown. There are some teams where there's a lot of back and forth on the core elements. It takes up time while certain parts of the game are being polished up, right? And they come toward the last 6 to 9 months and say, okay, could we tie it all together? Character choice. Continuing Quebec's work with Syndicate, Odyssey features both a male and female protagonist. Alexios and Cassandra are siblings who were separated during their childhood. Regardless of whether players choose Alexios, a man, or Cassandra, a woman, the main character will be an exiled Spartan mercenary. The other sibling will be a member of the secretive cult of Cosmos, an organization that can be described as pro-Templar in its beliefs. We wanted to embrace a little bit of a rebellious attitude with our characters, Dan Siro explains. They were exiled Spartans. We knew that the Spartans trained women to fight as well as men. They had some really strong women. Cassandra was very, very special to us, I would have to say. There was also a desire to represent what ancient Greece was like as a place. At the base of the idea of Alexios and Cassandra, we wanted to create characters that embodied and embraced what ancient Greece was about, Odyssey creative director Jonathan Dumont explains. Ancient Greece was such a rich setting that was known not only for iconic historical factions, such as the Spartans and heroes of mythology, but also for the importance of its foundational storytelling through comedy, tragedy, and epics. We felt that our main characters needed to capture all of that. Influences from the Spartan warriors with the flair of Achilles felt like a powerful player fantasy when combined with the function of a mercenary, which allowed players to face difficult moral choices and a wide variety of situations in a world at war. A lot of research went into the designs of Cassandra and Alexios, trying to make them look like they emerged from that world. From outfits to hair design to the models themselves, our artists paid a lot of attention to authenticity. As I mentioned, we were inspired by all facets of ancient Greek storytelling, and we wanted players to express themselves in a wide variety of tones, ranging from tragedy to comedy. I felt that Cassandra and Alexios needed to feel very human for them to be relatable. They needed to be able to show warmth and anger, to make us laugh and cry. It was a very difficult task that required the right actors to embody them. We conducted many auditions to find the precise actors who could truly play within that range, and we were very lucky to find Melistante, Mahut, and Michael Antokos. Not only did they do a marvelous job playing Cassandra and Alexios, but they also created that sibling bond throughout production, which was key for the story to work. Their story was also inspired by Odyssey's setting. The Greek tragedy is something that has persisted for thousands of years and was an appropriate thing to bring out in the story of Cassandra and Alexios. From a game perspective, the team wanted to allow role-play options in the story, and it made a lot of sense to push player choice as far as choosing your character, Dumont says. Still, we wanted both characters to exist in-world and to intertwine their destinies as we built their character and relationship supported by a Greek tragedy narrative where the importance of family was often at the forefront. Making them siblings of Spartan origins who had been estranged due to a family tragedy was something we really liked, and we started building their characters from there. It gave them a depth, a rivalry, and a bond that was very relatable. Though the game took place long before the formation of the Assassin Brotherhood, and even prior to Origins' Hidden Ones, Quebec wanted to tie the story to the franchise's main narrative. There are callbacks to some of the series' main aesthetic touchstones. Cassandra is known as the Eagle Bearer, for example, and there's also its iconic weaponry. We knew that we wouldn't have had a hidden blade at this point in time, which was fine. But we wanted something similar, Desero explains. At some point, one of our concept artists at the time brought up about the idea of fighting with a broken spear that could act as a hidden blade. Through the story of Odyssey, the developers wanted to showcase their vision of ancient Greece and all that it represented. Having two main characters who were Spartans but were more or less strangers to this world meant that the player was learning things alongside Cassandra and Alexios. The narrative of Odyssey is conducive to discovering the overwhelmingly rich heritage of ancient Greece in a layered fashion, while using structural elements from its storytelling legacy, Dumont explains. Simply put, we wanted our players to discover this awesome setting in its entirety. The gods, the war, the scientific emergence, philosophy, democracy, the naval tradition are all great themes and unfold gradually through Alexios' and Cassandra's odyssey in the world. While our protagonists are from Sparta, they have not seen much of the world, so they discovered alongside our players. They learned together. In the story, we use side characters as guides who embody those themes. For example, Barnabas, our ship captain, is a true believer in the gods and the myths, and he teaches players all along the journey Herodotus informs all we see from a historical point of view, and so on. All these characters make you understand the world in a layered fashion. The story of Odyssey is rooted in Greek tragedy and unfolds like an epic. It's a story about family and destiny, where the forces of chaos and order collide. But it's also about forgiveness and moral ambiguity. Here we use narrative player choices to allow players to live the story and question the world they see, which is in essence a lesson taught by the great philosopher Socrates. Not playing as an assassin isn't anything new for the franchise. As time has gone on, the approach that Ubisoft takes is that players will either be taking on the role of an assassin or playing as an archetype, the pirate, the warrior, and so on. This was in part due to the success of Black Flag. One of the things that we've noticed over time is that people will rally around a strong archetype, Scote says. That's not to say that an assassin isn't a strong archetype. It is. The whole success of the franchise at the beginning was built around this idea of playing a master assassin. But one of the things that people asked us to do was to combat what is called franchise fatigue. For us, one of the ways to approach that was to offer players fresh archetypes that were appealing. When we did this in the past, it often led to massive successes for the franchise. For example, the first time you didn't play as an assassin was in Black Flag. The funny thing about Black Flag is that you actually become an assassin during the credits, not in the main game. People loved playing as a pirate, of course. We addressed aspects of the game as being an assassin, but Edward was not an assassin. Despite that, we built one of the biggest successes in terms of satisfaction engagement that we have with the franchise. We had a successful experiment there, and it took us around 3 to 4 years to get back to that idea that archetypes are very, very powerful. They are a way to bring freshness and diversity to the Assassin's Creed experience. Though Odyssey was built on a lot of the same tech and with many of the same pillars as Assassin's Creed Origins, the Quebec team wanted to go with another tone in its game. We wanted to bring a different tone into the game, to make sure that there was humor, Dansero explains. We didn't want the game to take itself too seriously. Part of the reason something like Grand Theft Auto is so successful is that there's a dark sense of humor to those games, as well as the gangster fantasy. Often games tend to take that stuff too seriously. At the end of the day, this is entertainment. You were surrounded with a cast that enjoyed bringing light to the main character, and I think that that's the recipe that works for Odyssey. Azazia adds, Origins really was classic Assassin's Creed. It was a dramatic story about losing your son. It was incredibly emotional. People loved that, but the team wanted to make something a bit lighter for the next game. They wanted to change the tone, especially because they knew that there was going to be a family drama at court. The whole story starts out with classical drama. There's a murder in the family, betrayal, and everything. The idea was that the game should showcase different ranges of emotion and should be set in a super bright environment with an overall lighter tone. The team also learned this lesson from Assassin's Creed Syndicate, where they had needed to introduce a lighter tone to parts of the game in order to make it more palatable. Asking somebody to play a game that is dramatic for 30, 40, 50, 80 hours is difficult. It can be emotionally draining, as AZ continues. You need to have something lighter in order for the player to better enjoy the game. They utilize these different tones throughout the same game. That's not to say that Assassin's Creed Odyssey didn't have its fair share of emotional story beats. One of the moments that I still dream about at night is when you finish the introduction and it's revealed that the Wolf of Sparta is Cassandra's father, Cote says. I remember watching the scene for the first time and crying. What happened to me? Why was I being so emotional? I think there was something that was really gripping about his story in Odyssey, despite it not being about assassins and Templars. But again, that's what I think freed us to explore something unique and to build a great game. Color coding. As with Industrial Revolution London, ancient Greece has been portrayed a fair amount in popular culture. We can all picture the white and gold color scheme, which was prevalent in the Quebec studio's next game, Immortals Phoenix Rising. For Odyssey, the team opted to take a different approach to the aesthetics of ancient Greece, one that would encourage players to spend more time within the game. We did a field trip before starting production properly on Odyssey, and it was quickly apparent that Greece is one of the most beautiful places in the world, Cote says. That was something we wanted to capture. We hope to increase the player's playtime and engagement for this title. We thought that if Odyssey was aesthetically and narratively inviting, it would be something that people could enjoy for years and come back to time and again. The look of the game was built around the idea that it needed to be an appealing place. Dansero adds, I didn't know much about Greece before we went there, and I just discovered this massive land. It's super colorful. There are tons of forests and mountains all over the place. It's not what you see in movies, where there's this image of Greece in ruins. We needed to depict Greece as a vacation destination, even though we were in the midst of the Peloponnesian War. We wouldn't have been able to keep our players in the game if it was too oppressive, in terms of ambience and dark. At some point, it would have become too rough for players to stay in the game if it was so dark. Recreating Greece in Odyssey proved challenging, not least because this part of the world has its fair share of mountains and hills. We had a 16 by 16 kilometer map, which gave us a 256 square kilometer world, Dansro explains. We were recreating the whole of Greece, so it was quite compressed, especially with the mountains. In reality, the footprint of the mountains is much wider. The challenge we had is that our mountains felt like hills because they were so compressed. So we had to cheat. We had to avoid putting trees on top of mountains so as to not dwarf them. We also got rid of some mountains, but the mountains helped us create a lot of layering as well. They also hid stuff because at some point during production, we were able to see to the end of the Peloponnese from Athens. That meant we also had to play with fog and low clouds to try to create as much layering as we could. Compared to Syndicate, Odyssey was a far bigger world. The team had to turn to some new techniques to fill the game's Greek setting with content. We had to learn new production techniques, like working with procedural generation for vegetation, and with the world machine to generate terrain in the world, Densro says. We hadn't done that before because we had mostly been working on cities. We had to relearn everything while making Odyssey, basically. In order to ensure that this world was filled with interesting content for players to engage with, the Quebec team took a more curated approach. We basically put a grid on the map and said, okay, these are the different regions. Each region would have a really strong theme. One of them would be death and vengeance. Another one would be more political. One was going to be about philosophy. There were quests that are connected to health and some connected to history. We tried to balance all of the area to have a little bit of everything, but to still stay focused on the main theme. So every region feels a bit more alive and unique. Much like Origins Egypt, the team wanted to play around with elements of local mythology within Odyssey. But, this being Assassin's Creed, this was done with something of a twist. We wanted to have characters like the Cyclops or Medusa in Odyssey, as Asia says. But the funny part was we were going to deal with these characters by explaining that they were first civilization creatures, artifacts, monsters, but only like a third of them. When a player hears about the Minotaur, for example, they never know if it's going to be a real live Minotaur or just some huge guy with fur on his shoulders. Odyssey built upon the success of Origins. One could not exist without the other, but the Quebec team took the groundwork laid out in its predecessor and ran with it. The gamble of heading into more of an RPG direction also paid off, resulting in a title that people are still playing in huge numbers even to this day. Odyssey was one of our most successful games ever in the franchise in terms of player engagement and long-term engagement, Cote explains. We're still seeing tremendous numbers of players playing Odyssey today. Between the October 2018 launch and March 2020, Ubisoft reported that Odyssey had sold over 10 million copies. That put it in line with Origins and other smash hits in the franchise. Assassin's Creed Valhalla. Having been back to Egypt and ancient Greece, Ubisoft wanted to finish this trilogy of games off with another powerhouse faction of the ancient, the Vikings. This was something that the team who created Origins became fascinated with toward the end of that game's development. It's always like that toward the end of a production. There are a lot of coffee discussions and so on, Lafayette explains. The Vikings were fascinating, not only as people, but their culture and folklore were very inspiring. They could take us to some interesting locations, too. By the fall of 2017, as Origins was released, artists started to draw concepts and sketches for what a Viking Assassin's Creed game would look like. As always, the Montreal team had to ask the approval of the company's Paris headquarters. By this point, it was clear that Origins was a runaway success, which meant that management had faith in this group of developers. We did so well on Origins that HQ trusted us to do almost whatever we wanted, Lafayette laughs. Internally at Ubisoft, the team had a list of the settings that would be the most appealing to players. Vikings were one of the top contenders. We've known for years that every time we asked our players about what setting they'd like to see next for an Assassin's Creed game, the Viking Age would always rank as one of the highest, Picard explains. The Vikings were really appealing to players. The Viking setting was also a perfect period for Assassin's Creed. Taking place during the Dark Ages, this era was ripe for Ubisoft to insert its revisionist history of Assassins versus Templars. The Dark Ages were pretty interesting because it's not a well-documented period at all, Lafayette explains. That gave us a lot of leeway there. We've never done a game set in the Dark Ages before. When we started to dig into England, there's layers of civilizations on top of each other. Roman ruins and groups like the Welsh, the Picts, and the Saxons. To start with, the team tried to narrow down which period of Viking history they wanted to tackle. Several sprung to mind. One was the idea of focusing on a raiding party based in Norway, going to Lindisfarne, and all these different places, McDevitt explains. Then the other was the Norman invasion of England, so starting with Norman Vikings in France and then going over to England. But in the end, the team picked the Great Heathen Army's invasion of England because it felt like the most self-contained story, both geographically and historically. It just so happened that the TV show The Last Kingdom had recently started, so it was getting people interested in that era. They were just on the cusp of choosing that time period when I joined, and I guess when I joined, it was as if I was another voice saying, yes, that's a great time period. Having decided on an appropriate era, the team needed to flesh out what story they were going to tell. We wanted to start in Norway, but find a reason why you were expelled, McDevitt says. It was important to feel like you had been cast out from Norway, but that you didn't want to come back to kill the guy who expelled you. Otherwise, the story wouldn't be focused on England. England would have been the side story before you go back to the murder of the person who cast you out. We were really careful about designing a story in Norway, where you get banished from Norway because your stepfather basically makes a series of terrible decisions and gives up his kingdom to a young King Harold. You couldn't begrudge him for taking a good deal. The story surrounding the Vikings also meant that the team could create something that would serve as a contrast to previous Assassin's Creed titles. By this point, a lot of entries in the series had taken place around the Mediterranean Sea. A game set further north would certainly be a change of pace. With Origins and Odyssey, as well as with the Ezio trilogy, it's always beautiful blue skies, gorgeous bluey green water set in antiquity, Lafayette says. We felt like we had this opportunity to do something novel. With the Vikings, it's the North Sea, Scandinavian landscapes, England. All that felt pretty different. A different kind of Viking. The Vikings that have a place in popular culture are far removed from their real historical counterparts. For one, they didn't wear horned helmets. We can thank Wagner for that. Second, they weren't entirely focused on the rape and pillage that most people believe they were guilty of. Much of the history we know about the culture was written not by the Vikings themselves, but by those being invaded, stolen from, injured, or whose friends and family members had been killed. We had the opportunity to show a different side of history, Lafayette explains. The history of Vikings was written mostly by the people that they conquered, so it's probably a bit biased. Don't get me wrong, they were brutal. But early on in Valhalla's development, we realized that we had this chance to show who these people were and what their motivations, their culture, and so on were. With Valhalla, the narrative team was given a specific challenge by Ubisoft's editorial team. The idea was that the game would be playable exactly how players wanted to go about it. They wanted people to have a lot of choice in the way that they played the game and made the experience their own. Not just in designing your own character and equipping your own gear, but also in playing the story the way you wanted. And that flew in the face of strong narrative storytelling, McDevitt laughs. Narratives are strong because things happen in exactly the right order. Messing with that pacing can really throw it off. So we decided that if Ubisoft wanted us to have this kind of choose-your-own-saga approach, then we needed to design a game in a way that made sense. The idea that McDevitt and the narrative team came up with was for each quest to be its own self-contained story, rather than having the main golden narrative path and side missions. As it turns out, this is alarmingly close to the Viking sagas. The Viking sagas do not have a very strong through line, but they do have a strong central character, typically, McDevitt says. The big one that everyone talks about is probably Egil's saga, which is a foundational saga. It seems like it's got everything that you'd ever want from a saga. It's got a tough-as-nails protagonist who is a warrior poet. He just drifts around from Norway to Iceland to northern England. He fights with some English kings. As you read, you're just following this character around and watching him grow and learn. It's all about what honor is, what makes good leadership, and so on. We thought that if we had to make a game that allowed you to choose and shape your own story, then we were going to model it after the sagas too. Unsurprisingly, the Ubisoft Montreal team wanted a protagonist who offered a wide variety of the Viking experience. The hero of Valhalla wasn't just going to be a brute, pillaging lands far from their home, but a more rounded individual who had more complicated drives. We really wanted to have a character who was a leader, Lafayette says. So someone who was caught in the duality of having to lead, but who also had their own ambitions, goals, and so on. We wanted someone who had to be selfish and selfless at the same time, who was driven by their own ambition, but who felt really responsible for the clan. But we also wanted someone who could let the player embrace this Viking fantasy of being a warrior hungry for conquest and to expand their influence, yet also being a poet, someone who was curious and had a thirst for knowledge. That was something that is very essential, I think, to the character. That's reflected in the way Eivor talks. There's someone who's really comfortable using their words, like in the flying parts of the game, the rap battles that we have. Like in the flighting parts of the game, the rap battles that we have. Our goal was to depict the true range of the Vikings. The Norse were actually pretty refined people. They were not mindless barbarians. They were groomed. They were knowledgeable. They were amazing sailors. They were really complex characters. They weren't just out there thirsting for blood. They had reasons to be there. This is what we wanted to convey with our main characters. There's a rough exterior, but there's a lot of layers of subtlety for players to discover. Though the raping and pillaging that the Vikings are infamous for is definitely overstated in how they are often depicted. These were things that they did. That's a difficult circle to square if you're going to be playing as one of them for what might be hundreds of hours. After all, developers want players to like the person they're playing as. We wanted the Eivor character to have a slightly more modern sensibility, McDevitt says. We want you to feel good about playing as them. So we gave some more of the raiding and pillaging to the other characters to do, because it did happen. But we mixed this in with the realization that they're not just raiders at this time. They're settlers. What do they need to do to be settlers? Tale of two Eivors. In both Syndicate and Odyssey, players could take on the role of either a male or female protagonist. In the former, they could play as Jacob or Evie Fry. In the latter, they were able to choose to play as either Cassandra or Alexios. With Valhalla, the Ubisoft Montreal team wanted to continue the notion of choice in an RPG game, allowing the player to choose whether to play the male or female version of the same character. Playing as female Eivor isn't just an aesthetic choice either. Throughout the game, she has what appears to be visions of the first civilization. However, it emerges that these aren't visions at all, they are memories. When you choose female Eivor, you're choosing to play as the reincarnation of Odin, McDevitt says. I think that could have been confusing for people at first, but it's a cool mystery to solve. So when you come out on the other end of the story, Odin is reborn. It all makes sense. That allows you also to justify Eivor herself going into these memories, which are actually memories of an Isu named Odin. But the memories have this Norse mythology wrapper because that's what Eivor understands. She likely wouldn't have understood the sci-fi high-tech elements. She would have been thinking, what is all this? When they boot up the game, players are given the choice to play as male or female Eivor by the Animus, but there's also a third option, allowing the Animus to decide for you. Officially, this is the canonical choice. Choosing this also results in some segments where Eivor is presented as a man. This is due to the high levels of male Isu DNA in their remains, given that Eivor is the reincarnation of Odin. Much like Odyssey and Black Flag before it, Assassin's Creed Valhalla doesn't star an assassin. Eivor is a Viking warrior, but is brought into the series' ongoing conflict. Given that it's Assassin's Creed, it's always important for me that if we're not going to tell a story about an assassin, we have to tell a story about somebody who had an impact on the Assassin's War with the Templars, or conversely, somebody who had been affected by that conflict, McDevitt explains. We wanted to tell a story about a Viking, yet we didn't want to tell a story about an assassin in the Viking Age, because that wasn't a real thing. That's our own fictional creation, and if we had created a Viking assassin, they might have put us at arm's length to the actual historical meat of this time period. Playing as a Viking also helped the story come into focus for McDevitt and the group. A person from this culture at this point in history would have faced some unique challenges around which the Ubisoft team could work out a story and character. Once you said you were going to make a game about a Viking, the question was, what were the unique problems that they dealt with, McDevitt says. How would you show them dealing with those unique problems in a way that was common to all of us? It was a bit of a balancing act. The big difference about Viking culture, for instance, was that they had this idea of honor and shame. That was their culture. They weren't about virtue and sin. That's Christianity. Honor and shame were at the bedrock of Norse culture. We decided to tell the story of someone who is always in search of honor and sometimes feels in danger of losing it. They worry from the very beginning that they're going to dishonor and betray their brother in pursuit of their own honor. Prophecy was a big thing. Then we started to weave all of that into a story that evoked the Vikings, but which would also seem familiar to mainstream audiences. The game is about leadership and honor in all of the story arcs. When Eivor does touch upon the more assassin-focused elements of Valhalla, they are certain to do so with their own touch. Even the way they wear the hidden blade is different, Lafayette says. They wear it on top because they don't understand why you'd want to hide such a beautifully crafted blade. To new lands. In order to research Valhalla, the team went to a number of locations that the game would be set in, including Norway and England. After visiting the former, they had a better understanding of why the Vikings might not want to live there all the time. Once you spend any time in northern Norway, you realize it's very obvious why they went and robbed and pillaged, McDevitt says. There is nothing here. There are scant trees up in the north, and food is really hard to come by. If you visit Norway, especially in the winter, you understand how the culture could have developed. It makes a lot of sense. You can appreciate why the gods looked and acted the way they did. It's these incredibly dramatic, desolate landscapes that you can imagine the likes of Thor, Odin, and Freya existing in. Going there on a trip for almost 3 weeks was also quite eye-opening, and it gave us a very good understanding of how we were going to depict this as a full culture. Making England from this time period work within an Assassin's Creed context also proved to be something of a challenge. To put it bluntly, there wasn't much there at that period, and what would have been there wasn't as impressive as what had been shown in some of the previous games in the franchise. Very early on, I realized that landmarks were going to be a big challenge for the team, because that time, specifically that time in the UK, wasn't a moment where you had big pyramids, Duran says. There's a lot of beautiful nature, but the fortresses that they had at the time of the Anglo-Saxons weren't exactly what we had in the game. Instead, most of them were motte and bailey castles. They were wooden castles with wooden fences and a moat. That was not what this team was hoping for. So the developers found a way to bring more modern and more exciting architecture into the world of Assassin's Creed Valhalla. I would say we cheated a bit, Lacoste laughs. It was okay because it was for the game. It was interesting to play with both the different timelines and the animus glitches in the simulation. When we created the churches, we wanted to take a version of the church that would have existed a bit after the Dark Ages, because we wanted to have steeples, towers, and bell towers, which wouldn't have existed in AD 900. Because we were Assassin's Creed, we wanted to have rich icons. We had to have verticality in the game, not just for exploration, but so these different vertical structures would be seen from the distance. Additionally, we wanted these places to feel more alive, places that players would want to go to, so there was this welcoming feeling as well. And playing with the stained glass color made these very inviting and interesting moments of beauty. England during the Dark Ages might not have been the most interesting setting, but it was a location that had an intriguing history. It had been touched by an empire that spanned large parts of the world. We wanted to keep the Roman architecture as interesting and mysterious structures, Lacoste says. The aqueduct near London or the ancient Roman bath, all these interesting Roman villas helped to bring verticality. They also add mystery because they are big, tall stone walls and statues, remnants from these Roman ages. They have been taken over by people who are making small houses and fragile structures next to the walls of these ancient creations. There's a resonance from the past, along with some mystery about the ancient builders of these structures. These remains only help to bring this kind of romantic tone to the game. That was also a reason why we looked at the painters like Caspar David Friedrich and others from the 19th century, who made these interesting compositions using the rooms and the nature. So that's the angle we took for England. Make it even more interesting and make it more beautiful. As well as creating the different parts of England, the team also decided to implement a seasonal system. We had 3 different seasons in England to bring to life and add diversity to the world, Lacoste says. So when you go to the south, to Seven Sisters, it's during this beautiful lush summer. When you go to Lincolnshire, it's during the fall, so the light is different. The region is covered in shades of red and orange, and it's starting to get a bit dry. Then when you go up north to Northumbria, you get the start of winter. There it's colder, and you have these rolling hills covered with snow, which fit in well with the Viking aspect. We wanted to make these creative choices and change the architecture and the style to have these very bold feelings for different regions. Part of the story of Valhalla is concerned with the idea of finding a home. The Vikings' native land is inhospitable and cold, so they are keen to settle down elsewhere. This allowed the team to reach into its pocket of mechanics that it had created over the course of Assassin's Creed's history, and to redeploy the ideas found in Assassin's Creed 2's Villa Auditore or Assassin's Creed 3's Homestead, a place that the player can call home. Valhalla was a stranger in a strange land story, Lafayette explains. We decided to have a village in the middle of the map that would grow and which would make the player feel like a Viking clan leader. It was realistic. We were able to take inspiration from Villa Auditore and what we had learned from making the villa to make this village even more meaningful for players. At first, the settlement was even called Villa Plus. The team was even able to reintroduce the idea of social stealth. This had been a key part of the Assassin's Creed formula at the start of the series, but had become less of a focus in later games. We asked how it would be for a Viking to be stealthy, wearing fur, tattoos, braids, as well as an axe and a shield in the middle of an English town, Lafayette remembers. We figured that a good way to reintroduce social stealth would be for the player to wear some sort of cloak and try to blend in with the crowd. In some ways, Valhalla feels like the greatest hits of the Assassin's Creed franchise, bringing together many different gameplay mechanics that the various Ubisoft teams had come up with over the years. We were in a mindset where we saw an opening to capitalize on the brand history, Lafayette says. That got us excited. We decided to have a trip to America, to do a little tribute to Assassin's Creed 3. As we got our wheels into motion, we felt we had this opportunity to make the most of our brand, and it really got us excited. Hammer of the Gods. With Valhalla, the team had the chance to expand upon the lore of the first civilization. Previous games like Odyssey had featured members of this race, known to humankind as gods. However, with Valhalla's Viking setting, Ubisoft had the chance to talk more about the Isu. Our idea was that the first Civ were a real group of people, and that the myths we have as humans are the end results of a giant game of telephone that warped these real historical stories into mythological tales, McDevitt says. So we made the decision that said there was a Norse pantheon of first Civ, and that they were frequently at war with the Greco-Roman and Egyptian pantheons. Norse mythology is fun and wild and weird. It's not as well known as Greco-Roman mythology, but there's something weirdly beautiful about it. Valhalla continued the RPG elements introduced in Origins, though to a slightly lesser degree than Odyssey. Dialogue choices returned, as did that title's leveling and crafting mechanics, but one aspect that was changed was how weapons worked. In Assassin's Creed Origins, for example, players could find one of the most epic weapons and stick with it until the end of the game, as Izzy says. They could just upgrade the same weapon again and again. We wanted people to play and change the equipment. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, we introduced a system where every weapon, especially on the last stage, came with a unique skill and ability. That meant that players could build and create various builds and play with the different tools that they had to adapt to the situation. Another tweak was making quests feel more organic. That's why secondary missions are not flagged or tagged as a secondary mission, as Asia says. You have a character with a question mark over their head, and it's more natural. You come to someone, you can hear a conversation, you can witness an event happening. Then you improvise, and you use the tool that you have in order to do something. It's not always about fighting or killing someone. There's a lot of different opportunities in the world. That way the game feels more like a real place. On top of all this, Valhalla brings some classic assassins back into the mix with Basim, originated from the Middle East. This character will certainly bring back memories for longtime fans of the Assassin's Creed franchise. Players wanted more Assassin's Creed in Valhalla, as AZ explains. That's why we have characters like Basim, who, coming from the Middle East, is not only the embodiment of a typical assassin, but who also plays a major part in the story. Basim was designed to bring back the full-fledged assassins front and center. He's a character that really resonates with the fans. He's truly a pure assassin. Part of the reason that Basim is present in Valhalla was because Eivor wasn't able to do a lot of what the assassins are all about. The Vikings' philosophy runs counter to that of the assassins. It was tricky to mix the fantasy of being a Viking with the fantasy of being an assassin, as Azia says. The rule set that comes with being an assassin means that you don't kill innocent people. You are meant to hide in plain sight. Vikings, meanwhile, are generally meant to be raiding. That, plus killing innocent people, meant they weren't compatible. In popular culture, the Vikings present a striking image, something that is probably every marketer's dream, but the team had to think hard about how to portray them in Valhalla, given that this was intended to be a more rounded depiction of this group of people. There were a lot of back and forth discussions and debates, says Anouk Bachman, product manager on Valhalla and former transmedia product manager for the Assassin's Creed brand. Things like how we were going to present Eivor because there's ultra-violent Viking fantasy with axes and so on, but we also wanted to show more depth. Picard adds, the aim of the team was really to show the Vikings weren't the barbarians that they are usually portrayed as. We wanted to make it clear that they also had this whole belief system and culture. Everything was about honor, so we really tried to portray that in the game and in our marketing assets. Valhalla launched in November 2020 for the existing PlayStation 4 and Xbox One consoles, and also the new generation of hardware as well as PC. As a result, it was a massive seller, selling 1.8 million copies during its first week on sale. To date, it is Ubisoft's second most profitable title. With Valhalla, the second age of Assassin's Creed has come to a close. Assassin's Creed Valhalla: Dawn of Ragnarok. While Valhalla touched upon Norse mythology, it was still a very realistic game in a lot of ways. But some of the developers wanted to delve further into Norse mythology. With the expansion Dawn of Ragnarok, Ubisoft Sofia was given free rein to explore the beliefs of the Viking people. Set in Svartalheim, one of the 9 realms, the game has players take on the role of Odin to find his lost son. Eivor is an incarnation of Odin, so it is an opportunity to explore this facet of her character, Lazanov explains. It's a continuation of Eivor's story, but covers what Odin did back in the past. Odin is sent on a very dangerous journey to save his son Baldur. Baldur dying is a sign of the coming Ragnarok, the end of the world. In many ways, this is similar to the Assassin's Creed Origins expansion, The Curse of the Pharaohs, but rather than fantastical, Lazanov prefers the word surreal to describe the tone of Dawn of Ragnarok. It's still grounded in something, he explains. It wasn't purely fantastical. We wanted it to be grounded in the beliefs of people. This is part of the Assassin's Creed brand in general. That's why we prefer to call this surreal, because it describes and grounds it better. Approaching these more surreal expansions in the Assassin's Creed franchise was similar to how the teams handled historically based releases, by talking to lots of smart people in the relevant fields. We still talked with experts in these fields, and we read all the sagas that were relevant, Lazanov says. This is our prime source of inspiration. That's why it fits in Assassin's Creed, because it's still grounded in the beliefs of the Vikings. Curse of the Pharaohs was based on what was written on the walls of the tombs, and going into the beliefs of people back then. We talked to experts in this field, who sometimes are historians as well. We built narratives. We built characters. We built worlds that are true to these beliefs. Female Eivor, Cecile Stenspel. To portray the female Eivor, Ubisoft brought in Danish actor Cecile Stenspel. When she first heard about the role, she was told it was going to be a video game, but she wasn't told which one. When the time came for the audition, she was at home with a small child, so she had to retreat to the rooftop terrace of her house. I was standing on my rooftop terrace screaming, "For Odin," and so on, Stenspel remembers. I could see my neighbor walking past looking up, probably thinking that the actress has actually gone nuts. When she finally landed the role, Stenspel started working on figuring out exactly who Eivor was. This was very much a collaborative process between her and Ubisoft staff. As a young woman, Eivor had been attacked by wolves, she remembers, and I felt it was necessary that you were able to hear that kind of raspy quality in Eivor's voice due to her accident. Even though she sometimes speaks with a lower tone, she is still feminine. She just doesn't have a very high-pitched voice. She sounds a little more warrior-like. They actually grabbed onto that idea. It gives the character a lot of presence. Stenspel also pushed for Eivor to have a clear Danish tinge to her voice, something that had to be balanced with the fact that this was a game that be played globally. In Danish, we don't say Thor, we say Tor, she explains. I really wanted to have that rolling R. Of course, there were some compromises because everybody around the world needed to understand that it's Thor I'm talking about. When the coronavirus pandemic hit in 2020 and people had to work from home, Ubisoft even created a recording studio at Stenspel's home in Denmark. I had a studio in the basement and we had sound technicians working from abroad. They could remote control all my keys so I didn't have to touch anything, she says. I could just work and speak into the microphone. That way I didn't mess up anything with the sound. At the time of writing, Stenspel has been working on Eivor for roughly 3 years. By this point, she has an intimate relationship with the character. She's a driven, family-loving fighter with a warm heart, Stenspel says. She's a passionate Viking warrior who'd love for you to join her on her journeys. Male Eivor, Magnus Brun. Like Cecile Stenspel, Magnus Brun didn't know he was auditioning for Assassin's Creed Valhalla when he tried out for his part. He thought he was going to be part of a Canadian animated series titled The Black Wolf Saga. After a self-taped interview, he flew out to London to do an in-person audition and quickly landed the role. For Bruin, it was important that Eivor wasn't just a gruff warrior, but that he had many different layers. We didn't want to make this brute of a Viking who could only be a savage, Bruin says. We wanted to make Eivor a young Viking leader that you would want to follow, that you would want to hear stories about. You should feel like you could fall in love with Eivor, that you would want to make alliances with this Viking, but also you need to be intimidated by him at times, too. Bruin had previously played Knut Ronvaldsen on the TV show The Last Kingdom, so he already had a solid knowledge of Norse history and mythology, but he also says that McDevitt gave him a lot to work with. He's such a lovely man and very dear to me. His work is just incredible, Bruin says. I remember I did a line at some point in the recordings where Eivor arrives back at his own old town that is just a ruin now. It's a gameplay line, an inner monologue. Home, or it used to be home. Now it's nothing but bone. I remember that resonated so hard and heavy in me because that told the whole story of him losing his whole family. I remember stopping the recording and calling up Darby to tell him how good he is. This was also Bruin's first time doing performance capture, which required a fair share of learning. I'm used to being physical, but I had to wear this helmet with 3 cameras on the front, he remembers, so I couldn't get close enough to the other actors. If I actually hugged them, the head cams would crash together. Performance capture also meant that Bruin had to be clean-shaven so that Ubisoft could get the animation data they needed. I had come from The Last Kingdom playing this Viking warlord with a huge beard, long hair, and face tattoos, so I had to shave my beard off to do the face animation, he says. They stripped away all of the Viking and put me in this black spandex suit with dots on it. Asked who Eivor is as a character, Bruin says that they are a typical youngest sibling. They're more curious, more fearless, more adventurous, he says, but they also have the most heartfelt loyalty to their family. There are so many words to describe Eivor. Loyal, heartfelt, impulsive, loving, curious. And folks, that is the end of Chapter 5. Now, this Chapter 6 says honoring the original, and I have a really, really good idea or guess that this is all about Assassin's Creed Mirage, and if so, this will be the last video for a while until I finally finish the actual game. If it isn't, and I read ahead for the next page, then you'll see Chapter 6. Otherwise, thanks for being on this journey with me. This again is the making of Assassin's Creed 15th anniversary. I'll see you guys later. Bye.